It didn't begin with an explosion on television screens or an urgent breaking news banner, and that is precisely what made it so dangerous. For nearly 2 years, much of Europe lived inside a reassuring story about the war unfolding around the Black Sea. The conflict was presented as distant, controlled, and most importantly, predictable. We were told that the lines were fixed, that stability had settled in, and that time itself was quietly tilting the balance in favor of the West. That story is now quietly disintegrated, not through a dramatic offensive or a single shocking announcement, but in a slow, almost invisible way that escaped broad public attention. As global focus drifted elsewhere, one of the most fundamental assumptions guiding Western strategy toward Ukraine collapsed entirely. What unfolded was not a temporary setback or a tactical adjustment that could be corrected later. It was a deep structural shift in maritime power, one that directly affects global trade, NATO's credibility, and the security architecture of Europe itself. Yet many continue to treat it as just another chapter in a long war, and that misreading is dangerous, because when strategic changes go unnoticed, they don't disappear. They build momentum, layer by layer, until their consequences become unavoidable. The opening of what is now known as the Odesa corridor is not speculation or exaggerated interpretation. It is a confirmed reality, and without overstating its significance, it represents the most serious strategic defeat the West has experienced in this conflict so far. The comforting idea of a frozen or balanced Black Sea front can no longer be defended. Everything that has been said about stability in this theater over the past 2 years must now be re-examined. The belief that this front was locked in stalemate has been decisively disproven. What we are witnessing is not a minor correction on the battlefield, but the collapse of a core assumption that shaped Western planning from the very beginning. Russia did not execute a routine maneuver. It carried out a long-range strategic operation aimed directly at the heart of Ukraine's remaining economic and military capacity. The Odesa corridor was never about capturing a city or threatening an isolated port. It marks the start of a much broader process, the erosion of Ukraine's maritime sovereignty and, by extension, the credibility of the Western Bloc itself. None of this happened by chance. This outcome was the result of patient, sustained, and coherent planning carried out over time. That is why this analysis avoids dramatic language. The objective here is not to sensationalize events, but to understand their military logic, geographic significance, and geopolitical implications. Russia has now effectively asserted control over the maritime access routes leading to Odesa. By doing so, it has established a navigation corridor on its own terms and extended its operational reach westward across the Black Sea. With a single strategic move, the entire geometry of the conflict has changed. The central question is no longer how this happened, but why Odesa was always the real objective. Odesa is not simply another Ukrainian city. It is the country's only truly viable deep-water port. Before the war, its facilities, along with nearby ports, handled the bulk of Ukraine's exports, especially grain and steel. These are not symbolic goods. Ukrainian grain feeds large parts of the global south, while Ukrainian steel supports industrial supply chains across Eastern Europe and beyond. Control over the northwestern Black Sea means control over Ukraine's economic circulation. With a corridor under its influence, Moscow gains far more than a battlefield advantage. It acquires the ability to regulate, restrict, or permit the global flow of food. In practical terms, this turns the war into a tool of international leverage. The balance of power in the Black Sea basin has shifted. Pressure is no longer confined to Kyiv. It now extends to NATO members such as Romania and Bulgaria, and especially to Turkey, the guardian of the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. This reflects a classic strategy of geopolitical strangulation, using narrow geographic choke points to generate disproportionate political and economic influence. Within NATO, the warning signs are clear. Emergency meetings behind closed doors, a noticeable shift in language from talk of victory to talk of destabilization, and growing unease in both Washington and Brussels all point to the same conclusion. The alliance is confronting a military reality it underestimated for far too long. Russia has demonstrated that it still possesses the strategic depth needed to concentrate power on decisive regional objectives, and this operation was anything but accidental. This operation was built on secured logistics, expanded air superiority, the steady degradation of Ukraine's naval capabilities, and the systematic exploitation of vulnerabilities that were visible to anyone willing to look closely. Once again, NATO underestimated geography, its oldest strategic blind spot. Western planners largely viewed Ukraine as a modern European state fighting for territorial integrity. Moscow viewed it very differently, as a southern security buffer and a central component of its historical sphere of influence. That distinction matters. It reveals where the Kremlin is willing to concentrate power, where geography, economics, and military force intersect to produce lasting influence. To understand why Odesa sits at the center of this equation, it is necessary to step back from the immediacy of the current war. Its importance did not begin in 2022, nor even with Ukraine's independence in 1991. Odesa did not suddenly become strategic because of this conflict. From Moscow's perspective, its value runs far deeper and is fundamentally non-negotiable. To grasp why Russia has always been prepared to act decisively, we must look back several centuries and examine the imperial logic that shaped the entire Black Sea region. In the late 18th century, after delivering a series of decisive defeats to the Ottoman Empire, Russia began a systematic expansion southward under the rule of Catherine the Great. This push was formalized through the Novorossiya Project, or New Russia. It was not a slogan or ideological fantasy, but a concrete geopolitical plan designed to resolve a structural weakness that had constrained Russian power for centuries: the lack of reliable access to warm water ports. In 1794, Odesa was deliberately founded as the Russian Empire's southern maritime gateway. Geography had long limited Russia's economic reach and naval projection. Northern ports froze for months, restricting trade, fleet operations, and global influence. Odesa was created to break that limitation. From its earliest days, the city was built to serve imperial priorities. It expanded rapidly into one of the most important commercial centers of the Russian world and eventually became the empire's fourth largest city. It was cosmopolitan, economically dynamic, and strategically indispensable. Odesa's role was clearly defined. It was meant to channel agricultural production from the fertile southern steppe into global markets. Grain flowed outward, wealth flowed inward, and political influence followed. Odesa was never just a commercial hub. It was a naval anchor at the heart of Russian power in the Black Sea. Control of the coastal strip stretching from Crimea, annexed in 1783, to the Danube Delta was not an abstract aspiration. It was a permanent strategic objective. For more than 2 centuries, this logic has shaped Russian military thinking. Every major conflict involving Russia, from the Napoleonic Wars to the Crimean War and through both world wars, was conditioned by the same core concerns: access, security, and maritime dominance. This historical continuity exposes one of the West's most serious misunderstandings of the current conflict. Russian leadership did not suddenly discover Odesa's importance in 2022. From the earliest stages of the war, senior Russian military officials openly spoke about securing southern Ukraine and establishing a continuous land and maritime corridor. This corridor was meant to connect Crimea with occupied territories and potentially extend westward toward the Black Sea and the pro-Russian region of Transnistria in Moldova. In Western discourse, these statements were often dismissed as ideological expansionism. In reality, they reflected cold, calculated military logic. Controlling the coastline means controlling trade, safeguarding naval assets, and gaining strategic depth against external pressure. Without that control, Crimea remains exposed. Its naval base, historically regarded as Russia's southern fortress, becomes vulnerable to interdiction and containment. For Moscow, that vulnerability is unacceptable. Western strategists struggle to interpret this reality because they operate on very different time horizons. Western politics are driven by election cycles, public messaging, and short-term crisis management. Moscow plans on historical scales. Where Western capitals saw a Ukrainian port that needed to keep operating, Russia saw an unresolved security gap and a strategic vacuum that would eventually have to be closed. The entire security framework of the Black Sea reflects this logic. The Montreux Convention of 1936, which governs naval passage through the Turkish Straits, exists precisely because control of the Black Sea cannot be separated from control of territory and ports. Without durable dominance over Odesa, Russia's naval position remains structurally constrained regardless of fleet size. This point is critical and yet consistently underestimated. Western debate focused heavily on technology, sanctions, and tactical support for Ukraine, while overlooking a historical constant. For Russia, the Black Sea is not a peripheral theater. It is a vital space. Odesa is not an optional piece on the board. It is a strategic hinge. From this perspective, Russia's drive toward maritime control is not an unexpected deviation, but the logical continuation of a doctrine that merges geography, economics, and military force. The war is not only fought in trenches or along land-based front lines, it is also fought through maritime corridors, ports, and trade routes, and through the ability to project influence far beyond the immediate battlefield. In this context, the real question was never whether Russia would attempt to reshape the balance in the Black Sea, but when and under what conditions it would do so. Odesa, because of its history, location, and economic function, was always destined to occupy a central place in that strategy. What we are witnessing now is not a break from the past, but its confirmation. As the war unfolded, Western attention narrowed in ways that would prove costly. Political leaders, media coverage, and military planning became overwhelmingly focused on the Eastern Front. This concentration shaped every subsequent phase of the conflict, while global attention remained locked on the Donbass, absorbing resources, diplomatic energy, and public messaging. The southern coastal theater evolved with far less scrutiny. That imbalance mattered. After the fall of Kherson, Odesa became Ukraine's primary economic lifeline. Yet in NATO capitals, the war continued to be interpreted largely as a land campaign centered in the east. This misreading was critical. Ukraine committed many of its most experienced units to grinding battles in the Donbass, aiming to slow Russian advances through attritional fighting. That decision came with a hidden strategic cost. It gave Moscow the time and operational freedom needed to shape the southern maritime theater on its own terms. The true center of gravity was never purely territorial. It was and remains geoeconomic control of the Black Sea. By failing to recognize this, the West allowed Russia to methodically prepare the conditions required to open the Odesa corridor. This was not a sudden opportunity seized in the chaos of war. It was the result of sustained preparation rooted in history, geography, and a coherent long-term strategy. The next question then is how the corridor was actually opened and why Western-backed defenses failed to prevent it. The answer challenges many assumptions that shaped Western analysis from the earliest days of the conflict. There was no dramatic amphibious assault, no decisive naval battle, and no sudden collapse of Ukrainian defenses around Odesa. Despite years of speculation about a direct attack, Russia pursued a strategy of calculated strangulation designed to undermine the region's military and economic viability without ever needing to seize the city itself. This approach exposed structural weaknesses in Ukraine's defensive posture and deep flaws in NATO's support model. The first and most decisive phase focused on logistics rather than territory. Moscow's objective was isolation, not occupation. The goal was to sever the arteries sustaining Odesa and what remained of Ukraine's naval presence in the Black Sea. Russia achieved this through persistent, long-range precision strikes using cruise missiles, glide bombs, and high-explosive munitions. These were not symbolic displays or occasional pressure tactics. They were systematic and sustained, aimed at crippling the infrastructure required to move goods, fuel, and military supplies. Rail hubs, fuel depots, ammunition storage sites, and port logistics facilities were repeatedly targeted with clear strategic intent. Bridges and rail connections linking Odesa to the rest of Ukraine and to NATO's primary supply route through Romania were progressively degraded. The repeated strikes on the Zatoka bridge were not theatrical demonstrations. That bridge carries the coastal rail line connecting Odesa to the Romanian border. Its disruption sent a clear message. The region was to be isolated and large-scale resupply was to be made increasingly unviable. As these attacks accumulated, the resilience of Ukraine's coastal logistics network steadily eroded. What had once functioned as a defensive zone gradually became a logistical burden. Every additional unit deployed to the area placed further strain on an already weakened supply chain. Although the port facilities themselves remained largely intact, they became functionally unusable for high-volume military operations. Without reliable road and rail access, Odesa could no longer sustain prolonged defense or support meaningful offensive activity. Control did not require physical occupation. It required making normal operations impossible. At sea, the balance shifted just as clearly. In the early phases of the war, Ukrainian naval drones achieved notable tactical successes against Russian Black Sea Fleet assets. These operations demonstrated ingenuity and forced Moscow to adapt. However, they did not dismantle the core of Russia's maritime strategy, which relied on area denial rather than constant surface presence. The Black Sea Fleet adjusted by operating from protected anchorages and strengthening layered air defenses. More importantly, Russia expanded its anti-ship and long-range strike capabilities, increasing both reach and density. Over time, the zone in which Ukrainian forces could operate safely was pushed closer and closer to the coastline. This did not result in a visible blockade enforced by warships. Instead, it produced something far more effective, a risk-based blockade. Commercial shipping became economically untenable. Insurance premiums surged, routes were abandoned, trade slowed, and eventually stopped. In practical terms, the Black Sea became a controlled fire zone under Russian dominance. Maritime commerce could no longer function at scale. The final layer of pressure came from land. Russia's steady advances in the east forced Kyiv to commit its best formations to the Donbass, tying up manpower and resources in attritional fighting. That was the trap. By fixing Ukraine's strongest units in the east, Moscow stripped the southern coast of defensive depth. The Odesa-Mykolaiv axis became under-resourced and unable to absorb sustained pressure. Any attempt to reinforce it risked collapse elsewhere along the front. Russia understood this dynamic and exploited it with precision. The corridor did not need to be physically occupied to be decisive. It only needed to be controlled. The strategic effects of this form of strangulation were immediate and far-reaching. Russia established local dominance in the northwestern Black Sea, effectively dictating Ukraine's maritime access. This altered not only the military balance, but the economic logic of the war itself. Moscow gained the ability to impose commercial conditions unilaterally, depriving Ukraine of a substantial share of its export revenue. Odesa, once the country's economic lifeline, was transformed into a strategic liability. This moment marked a clear turning point. From this point forward, the conflict could no longer be understood solely through battlefield dynamics. The opening of the Odesa corridor is not merely a setback for Ukraine. It directly challenges NATO's credibility, strategic assumptions, and deterrence model. From a realist perspective, this is not an isolated tactical defeat. It is a validation of Russia's attritional strategy and a serious indictment of the West's inability to prevent a long-anticipated strategic outcome. At the heart of that failure lies a flawed assumption that shaped alliance policy from the beginning. From the early days of the war, NATO leaders spoke confidently about eventual victory, while, in practice, pursuing a carefully calibrated containment approach. The goal was to support Ukraine without provoking a broader confrontation. That balance came at a cost. Weapons deliveries were gradual, often limited in scale, and frequently arrived too late to influence decisive moments. The result was a prolonged war of attrition. Attritional wars favor the actor with greater industrial capacity, manpower reserves, and logistical endurance. In this case, that actor was Russia. While Moscow restructured its economy to sustain long-term military production, expanding output of artillery, drones, glide bombs, and missiles, NATO's industrial base remained largely oriented toward peacetime conditions. Western support emphasized advanced, high-cost systems delivered in relatively small numbers. These systems were impressive technologically, but they lacked the volume and persistence required to counter sustained pressure. Bureaucratic delays, political caution, and high production costs constrained the pace of assistance. Russia pursued the opposite model, prioritizing mass endurance and cost efficiency. In the coastal campaign, this imbalance proved decisive. Moscow's steady pressure produced a slow but relentless logistical paralysis. Ukraine was unable to repair infrastructure as quickly as it was destroyed, and NATO failed to replenish defensive systems at a rate sufficient to reverse the trend. Over time, this imbalance reshaped the threat environment facing the alliance. What began as a regional war confined to Ukraine evolved into a direct strategic challenge to NATO's southeastern flank. Romania and Bulgaria, both NATO members, now share a maritime boundary with Russia. The Black Sea has ceased to function as a buffer. Instead, it has become an arena of direct strategic competition in which Moscow holds a clear positional advantage. The implications for deterrence are profound. Deterrence is not built on statements or symbolic red lines. It rests on demonstrated capability and the willingness to act. When those lines shift repeatedly without a firm response, credibility erodes. Throughout the war, Moscow observed this pattern and adjusted its actions accordingly. The opening of the Odesa corridor confirms that the West was either unwilling or unable to commit the resources required to block a strategic objective the Kremlin considered essential. This outcome reinforces a belief deeply rooted in Russian strategic culture. Patience and endurance eventually yield results. It validates a doctrine centered on industrial mobilization, long-term planning, and the assumption that democratic systems struggle to sustain prolonged high-intensity conflict. For NATO, the immediate consequence is strategic fatigue. Years of political, economic, and military investment have culminated in the loss of Ukraine's most vital economic asset. Attention now shifts to what comes next. The corridor is not an endpoint. It is a platform from which Russia can maintain initiative and explore a range of escalation scenarios that directly test NATO's credibility. The alliance now faces mounting pressure to respond not only to contain Russia, but to restore its own standing. Yet every meaningful response carries risk. The Black Sea is no longer a secondary theater. It has become a central arena of competition with consequences that extend far beyond Ukraine. Energy flows, global food security, alliance cohesion, and the future of Western deterrence are now directly tied to events unfolding in this maritime space. The strategic reality is uncomfortable but unavoidable. Control of the Black Sea is no longer theoretical. It is being exercised in practice. With this shift, the assumptions that underpinned Western strategy from the very start of the war are no longer sustainable. What remains is a narrowing window in which decisions made now will shape not only how this conflict ends, but how power is distributed across Europe for years to come. This moment is particularly significant because it forces a reassessment not just of battlefield developments, but of the entire strategic framework that guided policy from the outset. For a long time, Western decision-making rested on the belief that escalation could be managed indefinitely through calibrated support, sending signals of restraint while expecting time to gradually weaken Russia's position. The opening of the Odesa corridor exposes the limits of that approach. It shows that restraint, when not backed by sufficient material power, does not freeze conflicts. It reshapes them, often in ways that favor the side willing to absorb costs over longer periods. The corridor is not simply a maritime development. It is the physical manifestation of a strategic asymmetry that has been quietly accumulating throughout the war. From this point forward, the conflict can no longer be analyzed solely through the lens of land-based territorial control. The decisive arena has expanded into economic access, maritime dominance, and the capacity to impose costs far beyond the front lines, with consequences that reach well beyond Ukraine. By controlling access to Ukraine's most critical port infrastructure, Russia has altered the economic sustainability of the Ukrainian state under wartime conditions. Export capacity, foreign currency inflows, and long-term recovery prospects are now constrained by an adversary that can regulate maritime access without occupying the city itself. This form of pressure is difficult to counter with conventional military aid alone. Addressing it would require either escalation, with all the political and security risks that entails, or acceptance of a new strategic reality. For NATO, this creates a deeply uncomfortable dilemma. The alliance must determine whether its existing deterrence model is adequate in an environment where influence is applied incrementally rather than through open confrontation. The Black Sea has become the proving ground for this question. Each unchallenged shift in control sends a signal not only to Moscow, but to other actors watching closely. The lesson being absorbed is not about stated intentions or rhetorical commitments, but about outcomes. In strategic competition, outcomes matter far more than declarations. The Odesa corridor stands as a visible outcome that reshapes perceptions of power, resolve, and credibility. This does not mean the situation is irreversible, but it does mean that reversing it would now demand far more difficult choices than those available earlier in the conflict. The window for low-risk, incremental responses has narrowed significantly. What remains are hard decisions about priorities, resources, and the willingness to accept escalation risks to restore balance. The longer these decisions are delayed, the more entrenched the new reality becomes. This is why the moment matters. The issue is no longer simply whether Ukraine can hold territory or whether the front lines move a few kilometers in either direction. The issue is whether the West can adapt its strategy to a form of competition where control is exerted quietly, persistently, and often without dramatic confrontation. The Black Sea now represents the frontier of that competition. How it is handled will shape not only the outcome of this war, but the credibility of Western deterrence in a world where power is increasingly exercised through endurance, control of choke points, and the patient accumulation of advantage rather than sudden decisive blows.